Hello and welcome to the Social Thread podcast. Social Thread is a nonprofit where you can be in a community where you can belong, you can thrive, and you can explore your faith on your own terms. My name is Robert Payne. I'm the Director of Community Development here at Social Thread. And with me always
is your sidekick, Rob Reinders.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. And today we have an amazing guest. And so, Rob, why don't you introduce our guest and our topic for today?
Yeah. So our guest is indeed the amazing Kristen Gallagher. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, everyone.
Kristen, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and then I will tell everyone why you're here. What are you doing here?
Oh yeah, who are you and what are you doing here, Rob? I feel like you ask me that question a lot.
I do. I ask myself that question every day.
So my name is Chris Gallagher. I'm a pastor in Reno with the people at First UMC downtown, and I am an enthusiast of the enneagram, which is a particular personality typing system. I learned it about 15 years ago in the first church that I served, and it has served me incredibly well. And so I use it as a tool still quite often as I'm doing the work that I do with people, all different kinds of people with all different kinds of wounds and rough edges and quirks and gifts and everything. You know, people are people, and so how do you work with people? So that's one of the things that I do.
Awesome. Yeah. So we invited Chris here today to talk about not just the enneagram, but why it's important to know yourself. To understand, who you are, why you do what you do, why you believe what you believe, because as we have in our social thread pillars and guideposts, underneath love yourself, we have know yourself. And when you go on a journey of faith, it's really important to know sort of where you're coming from so you can have a better idea of where you're going, or at least to have the tools along the way to help you navigate. And so the Enneagram is one of those ways you can know yourself. And, when I first heard about the Enneagram, Chris, it sounded sort of weird and new age and cultish.
It is. It's out of nowhere. Nobody knows exactly where it came from, but it kind of resurfaced in the 70s in Berkeley, which should give anybody pause, really. I mean,
oh wait, I'm out. No wait, I'm back in.
No, you're East Bay, but you're solid 80s, aren't you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm a child of the 80s.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, it's an interesting tool, but it's like any tool, it's how you use it that matters. I talk to pastors sometimes and they'll say like, man, I preached the worst sermon of my life, and 5 people afterwards said it was exactly what they needed to hear. People, if you're open to what God is saying to you, or what your heart is saying to you, then you can take anything and use it for good, right? You can kind of flip anything into a tool for self-reflection. And I think knowing yourself is really important, because as trite as this is, knowledge is power. And the things that I don't know about myself actually usually end up harming myself or others, because they're unconsidered, they're unthoughtful, and they're usually kind of knee-jerk reactions rather than how I want to be in the world, which is a person who's thoughtful and loving and kind and compassionate and patient, and all of those things.
So talk about the Enneagram types, and then I want to jump into like some examples of how, maybe knowing your type can help you with those, find out so you can know what you don't know.
Yeah, so I just started laughing because I don't know how long this podcast is, but I don't think we have enough time.
Short version.
The short version is everybody is intelligent in 3 ways. Everybody has cognitive intelligence, mental intelligence, emotional intelligence, and intuition, right? And we all use all of those all the time. Some of us, most of us, usually rely on one of those more than another. And so the Enneagram is a tool for paying attention to how you process and respond to the world around you, using that as a framework. So it's sort of divided into 9 types, but it's really 3 major types and then variations on those types. And the 3 types are head types, heart types, and gut types. So those 3 different kinds of intelligence. and how you use the primary emotion within that processing type. So head types tend to process the world through anxiety. It doesn't mean the other types don't feel anxiety. It just means that head types are better at processing it than we are because they're used to it. They live there more. Heart types process the world through sorrow, or sometimes shame. And gut types process the world through anger. I am a gut type. I externalize my anger. I am an 8. My favorite thing in the world is when people who know the enneagram come up to me and say, "You're a 9, aren't you?" Because it means I have disguised myself well. 8s are you allowed to curse on this podcast? You guys curse?
I don't know. It's first time
jerks.
for everything.
I'll say the jerks. We externalize our anger. 9s tend to repress anger, pretend like they're not angry, and then 1s internalize their anger. So their anger is directed inwards towards themselves. These numbers are just indicators. They're not rankings. So like 9s aren't better than 8s, although I would argue that they probably are better than 8s. They're just indicators. They're just labels. 2s, 3s, and 4s are the sorrow types. 2s tend to internalize their sorrow. 3s repress or deny their sorrow. And 4s externalize their sorrow. And then the same with the anxiety types, 5, 6, and 7. 5s tend to internalize their anxiety. 6s deny their anxiety in some ways, and 7s externalize their anxiety. And so there's sort of these 3 types, these 3 ways of approaching the world. And it sounds critical. It sounds like you're categorizing people by the things that they don't like to know about themselves. But I would argue the things that I don't know about myself are the things that I need to know about myself. Because anger externalized without any processing is damaging to the world. It's damaging to me and to my relationships. And so I actually do have to work on that. There are also huge gifts that come with being each type. We could get into that too, but
yeah. So you mentioned you're an 8.
yes.
And I want to think in like a faith journey context of how does your personality affect, what you believe, how you believe, like what, your practice of spirituality, or maybe your anxieties or your strengths around spirituality?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So the one thing I'll say right here is that it's possible to over-identify with a personality type. These are not prescriptive. These don't tell you how you should be in the world, but are descriptive. So they describe sort of how sometimes people are in the world. So if you see yourself in one, actually the way I tell people, it's your type when you read it and you feel incredibly uncomfortable and judged by it. That's usually yours. So my thing is, as an 8, 8s externalize our anger. We want to be independent because our deepest fear is that people will have power over us and use that power to harm us. And so 8s tend to balk at needing to depend on other people. We tend to be very protective of ourselves, and as people we see as weak or vulnerable. Martin Luther King Jr. was an 8, right? 8s who don't process their emotions can come across as people who do loyalty tests, who attack anybody they see as an enemy, and who try to accrue as much power as possible in order to wield their power in the world. And you can probably think of several dictators that would fit into that category. So that's the spectrum, right? MLK, dictator. So as an 8, of course, it's really important for me to know how I'm categorizing the people around me, how I see my position in the world, how much I pay attention to power dynamics, which can be a huge gift, but can also cause me to put people in categories that aren't helpful. As an 8, it's important for me to know that I am not God, that as much as I want to be independent, I actually do need to depend on other people. My work as an 8 is to take on some of the best qualities of the 2, which is to be more vulnerable, to be more open, and to empower other people, which from an unfiltered, unprocessed 8 perspective would be making myself weaker. But actually it's allowing other people to protect themselves instead of me having to put myself between the people I see as vulnerable and the world. And so there's a lot of growth and maturity that happens when you're willing to go, oh, okay, this is not the best part of who I am. I'm exercising one of my anxieties on the world around me instead of paying attention to who people are and how they are already strong. Does that make sense? So eights come across as very strong people.
Yeah.
But oftentimes it's because they're terrified that they will get hurt.
Yeah. Who are like the internal, like, contemplative types? Because I hear, you know, and to me, what I'm hearing is there's not one way we're all wired to practice, you know,
No.
faith, right? So you have eights are going to be more about being prophetic and social justice minded in
We're
their
gonna
faith,
fight.
and yeah,
We're gonna fight, and that's fine. But you know, fighting without some spiritual grounding will also get you in trouble. And so it's important for eights to find the spiritual practice that works for them. And I won't say that there's one spiritual practice that works for every type. That's certainly not how it works. But as an eight, I found that exercise is important for me. If I can tell the difference between how I would rate myself on the scale of, am I living into what I think a loving person is, based on, pardon me, whether or not I've gone for a run that day. That matters to me. That can be a spiritual practice for me. But contemplation is also great for me. And it's not true for all eights. Some eights need to do something else. There are types that tend to be more internalized, like any of those types that internalize their emotions. A five, for example, a five is somebody who processes the world through anxiety by internalizing that anxiety. And they think through everything. In the world of the 100-acre woods, the five is owl, right? I'm going to collect all the information. I'm going to process all the information. I will know all the answers. And this is how I will make it through the world. And so fives sink into contemplative practice very easily. And that might be a safe place for them to connect to God and to their deepest selves. But then their challenge is to connect to other people, right? And so for them, there might be a spiritual practice that helps ground them in what feels comfortable, but there might be another spiritual practice that drives them out into the world to be stretched and to grow. There are things that can help fives feel more comfortable committing to that, like having some very clear boundaries on what that's going to look like. But the things that stretch the fives in my life are not sitting in a room quietly and thinking quiet thoughts to yourself, but engaging in mission and service, because then they have to interact with the world around them. And that can be more challenging. So I think there's spiritual practices that as you go through the Enneagram, you can think about, well, where is my safe zone? But then what is the thing that's going to help me grow and stretch? And I think both of those things are important.
So, and Robert, I want to let you jump in if you have any questions. I could talk about this all day, but we talk about, like, whenever I think of the Enneagram, I think about it so individually, and I think we've been talking about it, you know, as it relates to individuals, and we all have different ways we connect and practice our faith and different spiritual practices, stuff like that. How does it all work together in community? Because we can't all just be an island all the time, right? Although we want to talk about, like, hey, this is, you know, I'm going to do what I want and I want to figure it out on my own. But we can't just avoid people as much as we maybe want to be an owl, you know?
No, the Enneagram is not meant to divide people. And I think most personality systems are not meant to divide people, but to help people figure out how they work best in community. One of the questions I get most often is, I'm working for this person who's a 3. How do I get them to fill in the blank? And it's like, don't. First of all, stop it. Second of all, check yourself. Third of all, look at your personality and say, how do I be the best whoever I am that I can be? Because I can't control anybody else, right? So it helps us check our reactivity to the people around us, which is huge, particularly, I'll say, in an election year, particularly when we're all stressed because of COVID and coronavirus and everything else, particularly when our nerves are frayed. It's important for us to check our reactivity. The Enneagram is really good at doing that. In fact, there's a tool that Ian Cronin and Suzanne Stabile, I think, present in one of their books about how do you pay attention to your triggers so that you're not externalizing your stuff on other people, right? So they talk about stopping, noticing where you're holding tension in your body, and asking yourself some questions. Why am I feeling this way? What am I worried about? And then the most interesting question, I think, is what am I believing about myself right now, and is it true? And then pivoting. So then you can choose, right? Because you've given yourself the opportunity to make a choice and not just to react. So like, let's say you're late to pick up the kids from school, although that's not an example that we need right now. Let's say you're late for something and your kids are waiting for you, and you're on your way there and you're stressing out. And so you stop, maybe literally at a stoplight, and take 20 seconds to just notice yourself, and you notice that you're feeling really tense and you're feeling really angry and frustrated and you're worried about your kids. And you start asking yourself, what do I believe? What am I believing right now about myself that's causing me to feel this way? And what you might be thinking, because you haven't been thinking, is I'm a terrible mom or I'm a terrible dad because I'm not there on time. And is that true? No, I'm just late, right? There can be grace for that. And so it's a way of offering yourself grace and not letting the negative tracks in your head take over about who you are and how you relate to the world. So it checks your reactivity. It's also really helpful to know that in any system, there is a personality, right? So groups of people have personality. Our country, our nation has a personality type. Most countries and most nations have a personality type, but smaller groups do too. Your family does. Your extended family together has a personality type. And so sometimes people feel pressure because the values of the personality type of whatever organization they're in and their own might have some tension. And so paying attention to that can help you, because then you can go, okay, this is where this is coming from. And then you can find some common ground instead of just trying to force your way into this system that doesn't process the world the same way that you do. So I'll say this, my first church that I was appointed to was a historically Japanese American church. They had all studied the enneagram. The personality of the church was a 9, which is peacemaking, right? They're very calm people. They don't like conflict, very conflict avoidant people. And I walked in for my first interview. I'm 24 years old. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm straight out of seminary. I walk into the lobby of this church, and of course the word had gotten around that there was going to be an interview. And so people had like lurked in the lobby to see who was going to come in. And I walk in, I'm about a foot taller than everybody in the church, white as the day is long, blonde hair. And I walk in and I think, what would a real pastor do? Because I'm an 8 and I don't want to be like, I don't know what I'm doing here. 8s walk into a room like they own it because they don't want to give people the power of knowing they don't know what they're doing. So I walked in and I said, hi, I'm Pastor Chris. Who are all of you? And they all started laughing at the same time and said, she's an 8, and walked away. Because they could tell. They had studied the Enneagram. They could tell. That is not a good way to use the Enneagram. But what it was important for me to know when I was serving that church was that my initial reactions to things were not the same as everybody else's initial reactions to things, and was not the same as the culture of the place where I was, for so many reasons. But being able to check my reactivity, being able to check how I wanted to fix other people who weren't processing the world the same way I was incredibly helpful for me in that setting. So yeah, so it does help you relate to other people, because it helps you know yourself well enough to figure out, how do I use the best parts of my personality in this moment and not revert into those places where I feel vulnerable, attacked, at a loss, isolated, alone, but to see that we actually do have a lot that we share in common.
Yeah, I feel like it helps us be, or it should be a trigger to help us remember to be more gentle with people and ourselves, and less judgmental to ourselves and to others.
Yeah, and actually the biggest criticism I've heard about the Enneagram is people say it's so negative because it focuses on what you do when you feel out of your depth, right? When you're stressed, or when you're, the word that sometimes gets used is disintegrating, which is such a perfect word for me most of the time. What focuses on that disintegration, but really what it helps you do is focus on the ways that you react badly when you're disintegrating and you don't have grace for yourself. When you don't know yourself enough to go, okay, there's actually a really good reason why I'm feeling stressed out right now, and I can be okay with that. I think that's a much more gracious way to deal with yourself in the world. It doesn't mean we get it right all the time, but at least we have another tool in our pocket to try
Yeah.
and analyze the situation.
Yeah. I mean, any percentage less we could be, or any percentage we could be less judgmental with ourselves feels like, any help is always good help.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You
It's
know,
one
we,
tool. Like I said, there's lots of tools, but it's the one tool that I found the most useful because it doesn't lie to you about having a dark side.
right. Luke, I am your father.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Um, we ask this question of a lot of our guests because we have a lot of listeners, a lot of participants in Social Thread who are coming from maybe less gracious, experiences of faith or politics or somewhere else where they're sort of finding themselves all over again, and that can be really scary.
Yeah.
And so, what advice do you have for those folks, and what are some resources that, whether it's the enneagram or not, like what are some resources we could do to um, maybe in a healthy way start exploring who we are again, and start building again?
Yeah, that deconstruction process, right? To unbuild the systems that you have formerly maybe thrived in, or even if you felt uncomfortable in them, that worked for a while, is such huge work. Whether it's a social system like a church community, belief system, whatever, to deconstruct all of that is incredibly difficult work. I actually work with a lot of people who are in that place. My my small group is mostly people who've come out of that much less gracious kind of places and have felt judged, excluded, or have been kicked out of places like that. And there's a lot of pain there, and there's a lot of grief there. And I think there's this temptation to, well, I know that wasn't right for me, and this thing is right for me, so it should just get fixed, right? It should just be fixed, and to not have grace for themselves in that grief process. And that grief process is huge. And so I don't want to say don't rush it, but trust that even when it feels like nothing is getting done, that there's work that's happening in you, because we can't really think our way into a new system. We usually have to behave our way into it. And so practicing a gracious lifestyle, or as much as you can a gracious lifestyle, might not feel very productive, but you're actually teaching yourself a new way. And so part of it is just be patient with yourself. I think the Enneagram can be helpful for that. I think reading theology that, how do I want to say this? I like reading the theology of people who aren't perfect, whose flaws you can see pop up in what they're writing, whose personalities you can see pop up in what they're writing, because it gives you a clear view that not everybody thinks the same, and there's lots of great reasons for our differences, and there's not like one that's the right way, right? And so I know a lot of people get annoyed by her, but I like Anne Lamott because she just lets you see the dark side. Like all of the petty thoughts that she has, all of the moments when she has to catch herself, when she has to correct herself, those moments when she doesn't see her own privilege and then gets called out for it. She puts all of that into her writing. And I think it's incredibly helpful, not because I think we should all try and be Anne Lamott, but because she gives you permission to realize, like, this is a process, right? Like, we're all still figuring this out. And so I wouldn't call her a theologian, but she certainly, there's a lot of theology in what she writes. And so reading people who are figuring it out rather than people who think they know everything, I think is very helpful. I think being part of a small group is incredibly helpful, because we will often think worse things about ourselves than we will think about anybody else. And we will often say worse things about ourselves than we will say about anybody else. And so one of the questions I often ask people is, that thing that you think about yourself, that expectation that you've put on yourself, would you put that on anybody else? And teaching yourself to have grace for yourself, because you have the mirror of a group around you who love you and care for you and want to be gracious with you and want to teach you how to be gracious with yourself. I think that's incredibly important. Those relationships are incredibly important too. So I don't know, I love the Enneagram. I think it's great. But if you're reading the Enneagram and you think this thing is so negative and you can't get out of your own way around that, pick something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something else. Find something and just try to be open and not think that everything has to be true, but just use it as a process for reflection and for noticing things about yourself. Because, you know, you're good people.
Yeah.
You're good people.
Yeah.
You're doing the best you can.
Yeah.
Ease up a little and give yourself the grace to actually grow. Because when we get hyper self-critical, what happens is we just shrink back in and we're too afraid to step out and try something different.
Yeah.
You give yourself permission to fail.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. All about finding that balance between we need to dig a little deeper, but at the same time, like, yeah, love yourself.
Yeah.
So, hey, somebody should make that a pillar for an organization. I love that. Let's build something off of that. Yeah.
I feel like you guys are doing a pretty good job.
Thanks. All right, Robert, I know we need to wrap up here, but yeah.
Yeah, this is good. I actually don't have any questions. And the reason is because I actually don't know anything about the Enneagram. I've been a pastor for a long time, and I've taken tons of personality tests, but I just know very little about the Enneagram. So it was fun for me to be a fly on the wall in the conversation. But thank you so much for bringing this insight to me and to our listeners. You know, and I know that Rob briefly talked about resources, and you know, we do have some resources on the website for our listeners. And so if you're listening to this podcast for the first time and you're saying, boy, I do not know anything about this personality or this Enneagram, or but I sure am intrigued, and it would be so helpful to know how I process the world through Enneagram. I know that it's awesome. And I tell you what, listeners, if you jump on the Enneagram, I'm going to jump on the Enneagram, and then maybe we can get into the meetup, and you can tell me what your numbers are, and I'll tell you my numbers. How about that?
Yeah.
Speaking about meetups, you can go to our website, socialthread.org, and get involved. And you can, of course, when we talk about going through and discovering your personality typing, I can't think of a better way to do anything that is related to your journey than to do it in community. And that's what Social Thread is about. And jump in to get involved. If you found this conversation meaningful and want to get involved by making a donation, you can go to socialthread.org/support and make a tax-deductible donation. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, Kristen, and it's been fantastic to listen to your wisdom and insight.
And hello to your dog.
I didn't say anything new that you guys haven't already been saying, but I appreciate what you do. I appreciate how you connect people. I think that, you know, we're hungry. We're hungry for that right now. And so I don't know if this is on your website, but the beginner book I found the most useful in the last 10 years is The Road Back to You by Ian Cronin and Suzanne Stabile. It's a good beginner one. So
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. And thanks everybody for listening.
All right. Next time we'll see you on Social Thread.